We live in a culture that treats constant motion as proof of worth. Saying no to plans after a draining day gets read as coldness. Wanting to linger in bed a little longer in the morning gets read as laziness. But what if that pull toward stillness isn't a flaw to fix? What if it's one of the clearest messages the body ever sends us? Across many spiritual and psychological traditions, the urge to withdraw from the noise of social life isn't treated as a step backward. It's treated as a marker of a deeper unfolding, a soul journey quietly asking for room to breathe. In that private space, a person stops needing to perform an identity built entirely for other people's eyes. They can ease, instead, into something closer to their own center, where a kind of restorative energy waits to be noticed. None of this is an argument for permanent isolation. It isn't a call to disappear from the world. It's simply an invitation to notice that some seasons of life ask us not to rush back outward too fast, because the moments we spend at home, doing nothing in particular, might be exactly what our inner life needs most. Think about what actually happens when a front door closes behind you. It isn't just a physical boundary. It's the closing of a stage. Every day, in ways so automatic we barely register them, we adjust our tone, calibrate our expressions, and manage how much of ourselves we let show. The moment that performance is no longer required, something in the body exhales. Only then do we begin to feel the true weight of everything we'd been carrying without realizing it. There's a useful distinction between the face we present to the world and the self that exists underneath it. That outer face isn't dishonest. It's often necessary. It lets us function, cooperate, and belong. The trouble starts when there's nowhere left to set it down. Home, at its best, is that resting place, the one location where the mask can finally come off and we can start to feel the difference between the role we've been playing and the person who was underneath it all along. Old stories carry this same idea. Wandering gods and traveling heroes take on new names and new faces wherever they go, but they always have a place they return to, a hall or hearth where their original nature waits, untouched by all the disguises. Every myth about a hero eventually points to the same quiet truth. Even the most legendary figures need somewhere they don't have to be legendary. Modern research on emotional regulation tells a similar story in different language. Constantly adjusting our behavior to match social expectations is expensive. It draws on real cognitive and emotional resources. When we finally land somewhere that asks nothing of us, the nervous system can shift out of alert mode and into repair mode. Staying home, then, isn't just physical rest. It's a temporary shutdown of the part of us that's always managing how we're perceived. You can see this in small, ordinary ways. Someone spends all day speaking carefully, choosing words with precision, softening opinions, reading the room. And by evening, all they want is silence in a familiar room. Someone comes home and has no desire to text back, explain themselves, or stay reachable in any way. This isn't necessarily withdrawal from sadness. Often it's simply a performance that ran past its limits, asking to be paused before it causes deeper harm. One woman who wrote in about her own experience described always being reliable, present for every plan, remembering everyone's birthday, holding relationships together. Then came a stretch where she found herself staying in bed for long periods, not from clear sadness, but from a bone-deep reluctance to face another day of smiling, listening, and never refusing anyone. As she let appointments slide and stopped replying right away, she realized what had actually worn her down wasn't the people in her life. It was the role of the agreeable one she'd been carrying for far too long. Her stillness wasn't retreat. It was her soul journey quietly insisting that the mask come off, even if only for a while, when there's truly no place, physically or emotionally, where a person can exist without performing. They risk merging entirely with the role they play. That's when emptiness creeps in, not from lacking purpose, but from having no ground left to simply exist on. People keep functioning, keep showing up, keep looking fine, while growing steadily more distant from themselves underneath it all. Staying home, seen this way, isn't an escape from life. It's a return to it. A return to breath that doesn't need adjusting. A return to feelings that don't need hiding. A return to one honest question: When I don't have to be anyone, who am I? That single question is often where real change quietly begins. Something curious tends to happen when a person stays home long enough to actually settle. It rarely feels like the peaceful, sunlit stillness we picture when we imagine rest. Instead, once the performance stops, an entirely different kind of material starts to rise. The residue of everything that got pushed down to keep functioning in daily life. This isn't a setback. It's a sign that whatever had been buried has finally found room to speak. Many traditions of inner work refer to this buried material as the shadow, not because it's evil, but because it holds everything our conscious mind decided was too inconvenient, too shameful, or too inappropriate to keep in view. Fear of being left behind. Anger we never let ourselves feel fully. Envy we were taught not to admit. A need for love we learned to disguise as independence. Even gifts and dreams we quietly abandoned because they didn't fit the life we were expected to build. While we're moving through the busyness of daily life, that shadow material usually stays well hidden. Appointments, conversations, and obligations act like a curtain over it. But when the pace slows and there's no one left to react to, that curtain starts to slip. What never actually disappeared, only got set aside, begins finding its way back into view. This process rarely announces itself through clear thoughts. More often, it shows up as mood, an unexplained heaviness, restlessness with no obvious trigger, or old memories surfacing out of nowhere. One person I'll call Linda experienced exactly this. Nothing dramatic had happened in her outer life. Everything looked stable from the outside. But once she began spending more time alone, unexplained sadness and irritation started showing up, and the fact that nothing seemed to have caused it only confused her more. Over time, it became clear this wasn't a new problem. It was old emotion, long suppressed under the need to always seem fine, finally finding an opening. What people often fear about extended time alone isn't loneliness exactly. It's meeting themselves without distraction. In that quiet, inner signals sharpen. You might notice you've been quietly angry at someone for months without ever naming it. You might feel the cost of an image of steadiness you've worked hard to maintain. You might brush up against disappointment in yourself that always felt too painful to look at directly. These experiences get misread as decline, but they're better understood as a shadow finally being acknowledged rather than avoided. There's a saying worth sitting with. Real clarity doesn't come from picturing only light. It comes from making the darkness visible enough to see clearly. That's precisely what unfolds when someone finally slows down enough to stop running from themselves. The shadow doesn't rise to destroy us. It rises because it wants to be met. And here's the paradox. Whatever we fear most about facing ourselves alone is usually smaller than we imagined. We fear loneliness because we've learned to equate it with abandonment. Yet in the safety of home, loneliness often turns out to be simple relief from constant performance. We fear old memories because we assume they'll only hurt more. Yet when we let them surface gently, most arrive not to punish us, but to finally be resolved. The real danger isn't seeing the shadow, it's denying it. Whatever stays unseen keeps operating quietly in the background, shaping our reactions, our choices, our relationships, without our permission or awareness. In the stillness of home, we start noticing these patterns for what they are: an outsized reaction to a small comment, an old habit of avoiding a certain feeling, a pattern that keeps repeating in close relationships. Each one is a shadow fragment asking to be understood, not punished. This process resembles walking into a dark room. At first, everything feels uncertain because nothing is visible. But as your eyes adjust, shapes emerge, structure appears, and the space turns out to be far less frightening than it seemed. The inner world works the same way. Only by staying in that darkness long enough does the shadow stop ruling us from hiding and start becoming simply another integrated part of who we are. None of this is about self-blame. It's an act of accepting that a whole person contains both light and difficulty, and that only by accepting our own imperfection can the inner fragmentation finally ease. Staying home, in the stillness that once felt frightening, becomes exactly the space where this meeting can happen, between who we thought we had to be and who is quietly forming underneath it. There's another voice that starts to emerge once the shadow work settles. Quieter, less dramatic, but no less important. It doesn't argue or announce itself. It simply becomes audible once we're quiet enough to hear it. Call it intuition, a form of understanding that arrives only when the noise clears enough to let it through. Staying home isn't only about occupying a familiar physical space. It's about settling into a psychological state no longer driven by outside pressure. When someone spends most of their time outside, juggling schedules, messages, feedback, and expectations, their mind is forced into a mode of quick analysis and safe reaction. In that state, intuition has almost nowhere to land, because intuition doesn't work through fast logic or urgent responses. It only appears when someone is quiet enough to actually listen. Intuition, understood this way, isn't a vague hunch or wishful thinking. It functions as its own way of knowing. Separate from pure logic, separate from raw emotion, separate from what the five senses can confirm directly. It's the mind's way of sensing patterns and connections that haven't been consciously worked out yet, a sense of what's forming before it's fully visible. The problem is that intuition can't develop in an environment that's constantly noisy. When a person is always explaining themselves, justifying decisions, and keeping pace with everyone else's rhythm, the mind naturally defaults to logic and immediate sensory reality. Intuition, being subtle by nature, gets pushed aside. It doesn't vanish. It just goes hungry. Only when the pace slows and no one is waiting on an immediate answer does intuition get the room it needs to rise into conscious awareness. After enough time at home, people start noticing signals that feel different from ordinary thinking. It might be an unexplainable sense that something is off about a choice that looks fine on paper. It might be a quiet, steady pull away from a relationship that still seems reasonable by every logical measure. It might be sudden clarity about a direction in life that didn't come from any analysis at all. It simply arrived, whole, as a form of knowing. These moments are often the self communicating with our conscious mind through a different channel entirely. Not through externals, but through the deeper meaning underneath events. For that inner meaning to come through, a person needs space that isn't already crowded with data, opinions, and other people's expectations. Home, when it's actually quiet, provides exactly that. And importantly, intuition doesn't strengthen by straining to hear it harder. It strengthens by stepping back from the constant interference of overanalysis. Alone at home, there's no one to explain your choices to, no need to rationalize your feelings, no one to defend yourself against. That absence of justification creates a kind of psychological softness where intuition can finally do its quiet work. We don't hear intuition with our ears. We sense it through a kind of inner resonance, or its opposite, a felt dissonance that tells us something doesn't fit. This inner sense acts as a bridge between our conscious mind and everything running beneath it. When a person lives too long inside pure rationality and collective expectation, that connection to their own deeper current gets lost. At home, as outside stimulation drops, that deeper layer gets room to surface, through images, feelings, dreams, and fleeting impressions. Intuition, then, isn't mystical. It's simply the native language of everything running beneath conscious thought. Picture the mind as an old, dense forest. If you never stop moving through it, you'll never hear the leaves stirring, the wind moving through the canopy, or the roots reaching quietly into the ground below. Staying home is the moment we finally walk into that forest without rushing, letting the inner landscape unfold in its own time, its own way. Research on interoceptive awareness, our capacity to sense internal bodily signals, backs this up. People who build in meaningful stretches of solitude tend to make decisions that align more closely with what they actually need, not just what looks reasonable from the outside. Intuition, in this frame, is the rapid integration of unconscious experience, and it works best when the nervous system isn't overloaded. Staying home also helps separate real intuition from fear dressed up as instinct. Decisions made under constant social pressure are often driven by anxiety mistaken for insight. But in the safety of home, When both body and mind have relaxed, real intuition has a distinct quality. It isn't rushed, dramatic, or forceful. It arrives as quiet certainty that needs no convincing. To live entirely cut off from this inner sense is to live only half a life, because intuition is often exactly what guides us when logic alone runs out of answers. At home, in that simple stillness, we relearn how to trust our own signals, not as blind belief, but as a relationship we're slowly rebuilding with ourselves. For intuition to become more than a passing flicker, though, a person needs more than quiet. They need the energy to actually stay present with themselves. If all our vital force keeps getting pulled outward, into roles, relationships, obligations, even the clearest inner signal gets drowned out eventually. This brings us to a deeper layer of what staying home offers, the chance to reclaim energy that's been scattered for far too long. When someone finally stays home, the first shift usually isn't rest. It's a slowing of the constant outward flow of attention. In everyday social life, our energy is continually directed toward the outside world, paying attention, responding, adapting, maintaining relationships, managing how we're perceived. Even silence, when it's the correct kind of silence for the moment, takes effort. Once the door closes and the outside world stops asking for a response, energy naturally begins turning back inward. This inner life force isn't just biological instinct. It's closer to the animating current that runs the whole of our inner world, capable of flowing outward toward others or inward toward ourselves. Imbalance shows up when a person keeps giving that energy away without ever building in room to recover it. Overextending toward any single fixation. A role, an ideal, a constant need to be present for others. Quietly drains reserves the same way any dependency does. At home, especially alone, that energy is no longer pulled by watching eyes or unspoken expectations. It doesn't vanish. It simply changes direction, returning to nourish the inner life it was always meant to sustain. This mirrors what modern psychology calls resource depletion and attention fatigue. When someone continually gives attention and emotional labor to others, their internal reserves shrink, leading to emptiness, irritability, or exhaustion with no obvious cause. A low-stimulation environment like home lets the nervous system shift into genuine recovery, replenishing energy passively but powerfully. Without this reclaiming, a person slowly becomes governed by outside circumstances and collective mood, dependent on feedback, dependent on relationships, dependent on constant availability to others. In the quiet of home, where nothing is demanded, a person gradually remembers that they are their own source, not simply a station where other people's needs pass through. One man, Henry, described spending years as the person everyone else turned to. Co-workers vented to him under pressure. Friends sent him long messages after arguments with partners. Family assumed he'd understand whatever came up. He listened, remembered, and carried all of it, until his schedule had quietly reorganized itself around other people's emotions. One exhausted evening, he told his friend group he was truly depleted and just wanted someone to listen for a few minutes. No one replied. 10 minutes later, the conversation had moved on to someone else's problem entirely, as if his message had never appeared. In that moment, staring at the screen, he understood something clearly. In these relationships, he wasn't seen as a tired, living person. He was a safe container for other people's overflow. That realization was what finally led him to stop answering every call immediately, to step back from those dynamics, and to choose more time at home. He recognized that continuing as before would drain not just his energy, but his whole inner life. Time at home, done regularly, helps us notice where our energy actually goes. After spending time with someone, do we feel fuller or more depleted? After a day of constant interaction, how long does it take to recover? These are questions we can only ask when we're quiet enough to actually feel the answer. And that capacity to feel is the foundation of any real emotional boundary. Staying home, then, isn't simply rest. It's an act of reclaiming energetic ownership. We don't withdraw to avoid life. We withdraw so life doesn't drain us to the point where we forget who we are underneath it all. Once energy has sufficiently returned, a person can step back into the world with real presence, instead of showing up depleted and running on borrowed vitality. If you've ever wanted to disappear from the world simply because you were worn down by absorbing other people's heaviness, that isn't selfishness, and it isn't a lack of care for others. It's clarity arriving. The recognition that your energy has been given away for too long, and that now is the moment to take it back. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Becoming yourself is a long road, built from small, ongoing efforts rather than one dramatic transformation. But what if the pull to stay home on certain days is actually the doorway back to that privilege? Sometimes the desire to lie still on the couch or to sit quietly in front of a mirror at home is tied directly to the need to simply remain with yourself. Not to accomplish anything, not to prove anything, but to listen to what's unfolding beneath the surface. This isn't regression. It's the opening note of a much longer soul journey. One where you slowly stop living entirely by inherited expectation and start living closer to your actual psychological center. This journey isn't about becoming remarkable, and it isn't about cutting yourself off from other people. It unfolds through subtle, persistent inner